In relationships, words are rarely just words. What a woman says in emotional moments often carries meaning that goes beyond the surface level of the sentence itself. Many men take statements too literally, reacting immediately without understanding the emotional context behind them. This often leads to confusion, unnecessary conflict, or poor decisions made in the heat of the moment. But when you slow down and look at communication through the lens of emotional psychology, you begin to see patterns instead of isolated statements. Women often express feelings indirectly, especially when emotions are complex, uncertain, or evolving. This does not mean they are being deceptive. It simply reflects how emotional processing and communication can work in relational dynamics. A statement made in frustration may not represent a final decision. A statement made in distance may reflect internal processing rather than rejection. And a statement made during tension may be more about emotional state than long-term intention. Most men lose clarity in these moments because they respond to words without understanding emotional undercurrents. But the stronger approach is interpretation, not reaction. When you understand what certain types of statements often indicate, you gain emotional control and avoid unnecessary escalation or overreaction. In this video, you will learn how to interpret 7 common types of statements women may say in relationships, what they often mean beneath the surface, and how to respond with emotional stability instead of impulsive reaction. The goal is not to overanalyze or assume the worst, but to develop awareness so you can respond with clarity, protect your emotional balance, and maintain respect in the dynamic. Because in relationships, understanding meaning is often more powerful than reacting to words. 1. I need space. When a woman says she needs space, many men immediately panic or assume the worst. But this statement is often less about ending the relationship and more about emotional regulation. In female psychology, needing space usually means she is overwhelmed, processing emotions, or trying to regain internal balance. It is a pause, not always a conclusion. The mistake men make is reacting instantly by chasing, over-messaging, or demanding clarity. That reaction often creates pressure, which makes the space feel even more necessary. When space is requested, the first signal is that emotional intensity has reached a level where distance feels like relief. This does not automatically mean loss of interest, but it does mean emotional reset is needed. How you respond in this moment is critical. If you respect the space without emotional pressure, you maintain stability in the dynamic. If you resist it, you create tension. Many men misunderstand space as rejection and try to fix it immediately, but space is not always a breakup signal. It is often a regulation mechanism. During this period, she is not necessarily making a final decision, but she is stepping back to think clearly without emotional noise. This is why over-communication during this phase usually backfires. It fills the space with pressure instead of allowing clarity to form. A grounded response is calm acknowledgement and emotional restraint. You continue your life without trying to force immediate reconnection. This communicates strength, not detachment from care, but control over reaction. Female psychology in this phase often evaluates how you handle distance. If you respect it, it can build trust. If you resist it, it can create emotional fatigue. Space also gives both sides perspective. It removes emotional intensity so real feelings can be understood more clearly. The key mistake is interpreting space as an immediate threat instead of an emotional processing stage. When handled correctly, space can stabilize a connection rather than end it. But when handled poorly, it can escalate distance unnecessarily. The difference is not in what she says, but in how you respond to it under emotional pressure. 2. You've changed. When a woman says, "you've changed," it often triggers confusion in men because it feels like a judgment rather than an observation. But in emotional psychology, this statement is usually about perceived shift in behavior, attention, or emotional presence. It does not always mean something negative. It means the version of you she is used to is no longer the version she is experiencing in the moment. Change in this context is about contrast. She is comparing current interaction patterns with past ones and noticing a difference in tone, availability, or emotional engagement. Many men react defensively to this statement, trying to explain themselves or prove they are still the same person. But over-explaining usually increases tension instead of reducing it. The emotional weight behind this statement is not always about the change itself, but about the uncertainty it creates. When familiarity shifts, the mind tries to label what is happening. In some cases, "you've changed" can reflect disappointment, but in other cases, it can reflect curiosity or emotional recalibration. The key is not to panic or immediately revert behavior just to avoid discomfort. That often leads to inconsistency. A grounded response is to stay calm and acknowledge without emotional escalation. You do not need to argue against the statement or force reassurance. Instead, your consistency over time communicates more than immediate reaction. Female psychology in this moment is often evaluating whether the change is temporary, intentional, or stable. If your behavior is grounded and consistent, it reduces confusion. If your behavior becomes reactive or inconsistent, it reinforces uncertainty. The important understanding here is that change itself is not the issue. The issue is how that change is interpreted emotionally. When handled with calmness, this statement can lead to clarity rather than conflict. But when handled with defensiveness, it can deepen emotional distance. The strongest position is emotional stability without urgency to prove anything. 3. I don't know what I want. When a woman says, "I don't know what I want," many men instantly treat it like a final answer, but emotionally, it is often a sign of internal conflict rather than a fixed decision. In female psychology, this statement usually appears when feelings, expectations, or relationship direction feel unclear or mismatched internally. It reflects a state of uncertainty, not always rejection. At this point, she is not fully committed to a clear emotional direction, and pressure only makes that uncertainty stronger. Many men react by trying to provide answers, asking repeated questions, or pushing for immediate clarity. But forcing clarity in an unclear emotional state often creates more confusion, not resolution. This statement can arise when emotional attraction fluctuates, when external stress affects perception, or when the connection no longer feels as predictable as before. It is a mental and emotional pause point. The danger for men is interpreting this as something they must fix immediately through persuasion or emotional intensity. That approach usually leads to imbalance because it shifts focus from understanding to convincing. A grounded response does not demand instant definition. It allows space for processing without emotional pressure. This does not mean detachment or indifference. It means not forcing structure onto a moment that is still forming internally. Female psychology in this phase often involves reflection over time rather than immediate resolution. The mind is trying to align feelings with reality, and that process cannot be rushed through argument or urgency. When a man remains calm and does not escalate emotionally, it reduces pressure in the interaction. That reduction of pressure allows clarity to form naturally. If the connection still holds value, clarity often returns with time. If it does not, forcing answers would not have changed the outcome anyway. The key mistake is believing uncertainty must be resolved immediately. Emotional clarity develops through stability, not pressure. When handled correctly, this phase becomes a moment of reflection rather than conflict. When handled poorly, it becomes a cycle of confusion and emotional exhaustion. The strongest response is patience combined with self-control, allowing clarity to develop without forcing direction. 4. "You don't care anymore." When a woman says, "You don't care anymore," it is often not a literal accusation, but an emotional interpretation of perceived distance. In many cases, this statement comes when she feels a change in attention, effort, or emotional engagement. Female psychology in this moment is less about facts and more about feelings. She is responding to how the connection feels in the present compared to how it felt before. When emotional signals shift, the mind tries to explain that shift in simple terms, and this phrase often becomes the label for that experience. Many men react defensively by trying to prove they still care, sending long explanations, or increasing effort suddenly. But excessive reassurance during emotional tension can sometimes create more imbalance because it introduces pressure instead of clarity. The core issue behind this statement is often emotional distance perception, not necessarily absence of care. That perception can come from reduced communication, lower emotional intensity, or inconsistency in engagement. Instead of reacting immediately, understanding the emotional context is more effective. In some cases, this statement is a way of seeking reassurance. In other cases, it is a reflection of emotional frustration. The key is not to assume one fixed meaning, but to observe the overall pattern of interaction. A grounded response is calm acknowledgement without overreaction. You do not need to overcompensate or enter emotional defense mode. Stability in response often communicates more reassurance than words alone. Female psychology in this stage often evaluates consistency over time rather than single reactions. If your behavior remains steady and aligned, the feeling of not caring can fade as perception adjusts. If your behavior becomes reactive or inconsistent, it can reinforce emotional distance. The important distinction here is between actual emotional disconnection and perceived emotional shift. Many misunderstandings in relationships happen because perception and reality temporarily diverge. When handled with calmness, this statement can become a moment of recalibration rather than conflict. But when met with emotional escalation, it often deepens misunderstanding. The strongest approach is controlled presence, not over-explanation, not defensiveness, but steady behavior that allows emotional perception to stabilize naturally over time. 5. I think we should take a break. When a woman says, "I think we should take a break," it is often a sign that emotional pressure has reached a point where distance feels necessary for clarity. In female psychology, this statement usually appears when the connection feels overwhelming, uncertain, or emotionally misaligned at that moment. It is not always a final ending, but it is a strong indicator that space is being requested in a structured way. Many men react to this statement with panic, negotiation, or emotional pleading, but those reactions often increase the sense of pressure that led to the statement in the first place. A break is usually not just about separation, but about emotional reset. It is a way to step out of intensity and evaluate feelings without constant interaction shaping perception. At this stage, communication has often become emotionally heavy or inconsistent, and stepping back feels like the only way to regain clarity. The mistake many men make is trying to prevent the break through immediate persuasion or over-promising change. That approach often creates resistance rather than reassurance. In female psychology, decisions made during emotional overload are often reconsidered once distance and calmness return. This is why pressure during this moment is counterproductive. A grounded response is calm acceptance without emotional escalation. This does not mean indifference or lack of care, but it means not turning the moment into a conflict or emotional struggle. The way you respond here shapes how the break is experienced. If handled with composure, it creates space for reflection rather than resentment. If handled with panic, it increases emotional fatigue and reinforces distance. During this phase, both individuals are often reassessing emotional compatibility, communication balance, and internal feelings. The outcome is not decided by one statement alone, but by the emotional environment that follows. If there is still genuine connection, space can sometimes allow clarity to rebuild understanding. If the connection is already unstable, pressure will not prevent separation. The key understanding here is that emotional breaks are not just about separation, but about processing unresolved tension. And how you conduct yourself during that period determines whether clarity leads to reconnection or final distance. Stability, restraint, and emotional control are the strongest responses in this moment. 6. You're just like every other man. When a woman says, "You're just like every other man," it is usually not a literal comparison to all men, but an emotional expression of disappointment, frustration, or unmet expectations. In female psychology, this statement often appears when behavior does not match emotional expectations that were formed during the connection. It reflects a feeling of emotional letdown more than an objective evaluation of character. Many men react defensively to this statement, trying to prove they are different or arguing against the comparison. But emotional statements made in frustration are rarely resolved through direct debate. Instead, they often escalate tension. This phrase is typically rooted in accumulated emotional experiences rather than a single moment. It may come after repeated misunderstandings, perceived inconsistency, or unmet emotional needs. The mind simplifies complex emotional frustration into a broad label, which is easier to express in a moment of emotional intensity. The mistake men make is taking this statement as a final judgment rather than an emotional reaction. A grounded response does not engage in argument or over-explanation. It acknowledges the emotional state without feeding into escalation. Trying to immediately disprove this statement often shifts focus away from understanding and toward conflict. Female psychology in this moment is often seeking emotional recognition rather than logical correction. She is expressing how the experience feels, not delivering a structured analysis of reality. When a man remains calm and does not react defensively, it prevents the situation from escalating further. Over time, consistency in behavior matters more than immediate verbal correction. If actions over time do not match the emotional perception behind the statement, the feeling behind it can fade naturally. If behavior remains inconsistent or reactive, it reinforces the emotional label. The key understanding is that this statement is often a snapshot of emotional frustration, not a permanent identity judgment. How you respond determines whether the emotional tension softens or hardens. Stability, patience, and controlled communication are more effective than argument or defense. The strongest position is to remain grounded without trying to force immediate emotional reversal. 7. I'm fine. When a woman says, "I'm fine," it is often one of the most misunderstood statements in relationships because it rarely reflects the full emotional state behind it. In female psychology, this phrase can mean different things depending on context, tone, and the emotional environment at the time. It can signal genuine calmness, but in many cases, it reflects unresolved feelings that are not being openly expressed in that moment. The key point is that "I'm fine" is often more about emotional containment than emotional clarity. Many men make the mistake of accepting it at face value without observing the surrounding behavior. When this statement is used during tension, it often means emotions are present but not yet processed or communicated. Instead of immediate explanation, there is emotional holding. This can happen when a woman does not feel ready to discuss what she is feeling or when she is trying to avoid escalation in the moment. The danger for men is either ignoring it completely or pushing too hard for answers. Ignoring it can create emotional distance, while pushing for clarity too aggressively can increase resistance. A balanced response is calm awareness without pressure. You acknowledge the moment without forcing emotional disclosure. In many cases, emotional clarity comes after space and time rather than immediate questioning. Female psychology in this stage often involves internal processing before verbal expression. The feelings are not necessarily hidden intentionally, but they are still forming into something that can be communicated clearly. When a man remains steady and does not react with urgency, it creates a safer environment for eventual openness. If pressure is applied, it can reinforce emotional withdrawal or defensiveness. This statement often carries more meaning in what is not being said than in the words themselves. Observing patterns over time is more important than reacting to a single moment. If "I'm fine" is consistently followed by distance or emotional withdrawal, it signals unresolved tension. If it is followed by normal engagement, it may simply be a temporary emotional pause. The strongest response is emotional control, not interpretation based on panic. Stability allows clarity to surface naturally, while pressure often delays or distorts it. Understanding this distinction helps maintain emotional balance and prevents unnecessary escalation in communication. When a woman says certain emotional statements, the real meaning is rarely found in the surface words alone. It is found in timing, tone, behavior patterns, and the emotional context surrounding the interaction. Many men make the mistake of reacting too quickly to phrases without understanding that most communication in relationships carries emotional subtext. These statements often reflect internal processing, temporary emotional states, or attempts to manage pressure rather than fixed decisions. The strongest approach is not to overanalyze every sentence, but to develop emotional stability in how you respond. When you remain calm, you reduce tension. When you avoid defensiveness, you maintain clarity. When you do not rush to force answers, you allow understanding to form naturally over time. Emotional control does not mean ignoring communication, but it means responding with awareness instead of impulse. At the core of all these situations is one principle: consistency matters more than reaction. Words may create temporary confusion, but patterns reveal truth over time. And when you learn to interpret behavior without emotional panic, you protect your peace, your clarity, and your respect in any relationship dynamic.